What's up YouTube? So if I get this video edited and out in time, today should hopefully be Vital's birthday. So it's been 1 year since the release of this epic VST plugin, which ironically has become pretty vital in my workflow or sound design toolbox. And I'm sure for a lot of you guys who follow my channel too. So anyway, it's been 1 year since the release of Vital, and I figured it's only appropriate to do an absolutely mammoth video going over something like 50 tips for Vital, spanning from the very beginner stuff that I get asked about a lot in my streams and my videos to the more advanced sound design weird techniques. So this is the 50 tips that you need to know for Vital from beginner to pro. Let's dive in and have a look. So first and foremost, the thing that confuses a lot of people when they first get into Vital is the fact that Vital doesn't have an octave switch. For those who don't know much about music theory, an octave is the same as 12 semitones. So most of the time to switch an octave, you would just switch the oscillator up or down by 12 semitones. There is, in fact, a shortcut to do this. If you hold shift and you scroll your mouse wheel, or if you hold shift and you move the parameter, it does it in increments of 12. So this is how you negate the need for an octave switch like in Serum or some other plugins that have octave parameters where you don't actually need it. You can just hold shift and either mouse wheel or use the parameter as regular. So tip number 2 is how Vital handles folders in the interface. So a lot of people still don't know this, that Vital's folder system it uses a kind of nested folder system, which is really, really cool. So say, for example, I've got my user folder of LFO shapes over here. I can just jump over to this, and I've got a separate folder within this of like Euclidean rhythms, which have a bunch of like rhythms built in. So it's really cool that you kind of have the ability to, you know, nest things within folders. And this isn't just with the LFO shapes, it's with the actual wavetables as well. They're all nested within folders. So you can actually get really deep with it. And that's why I think this interface is so good, specifically for keeping big libraries of wavetables and that kind of thing, because you can keep them very methodically inside folders and that kind of thing. So that's one thing that I still get asked about quite a bit, is this whole kind of folder system. Tip number 3 is the semitone/hertz view on filters and effects and that kind of thing. So let's say, for example, if we open up a filter over here, the cool thing about Vital is you can tune filters specifically to semitones, and by default it actually shows you what the exact semitone is. So if we key track this filter, key track to 100%, then this cutoff is always going to be at the root note of what we trigger. We can set it to exactly 1 octave up by pressing 12 semitones, etc., etc. This might not work for some people, although this might work for some people depending. You know, some people prefer having an actual hertz readout, some people prefer having a semitones. Thankfully in Vital you can actually choose which one suits you best. Over here in the advanced menu, down here at the bottom, you can choose frequency units in semitones or hertz. So if you set it over to hertz and you jump back over to the filter, you'll see that it gives us the actual hertz value. So this is helpful if you're copying patches over from something like Serum and you want to get the exact sound. Then you're able to actually punch in the exact frequency in hertz. Whereas, you know, Vital is a little bit of an outlier in the fact that it shows the semitones readout. Not many plugins have done that in the past. And personally, I like it because most of the time when I'm sound designing, I want stuff to be coherent to a certain pitch or to the root note or something. So I think that's particularly helpful. Just being able to choose is very cool. So tip number 4 is the copy paste functions. So what this allows you to do is copy LFOs. So let's say copy and paste, or let's say, for example, choose something a bit more strange like this. We can copy this and paste it onto another oscillator. And this is particularly helpful, say, for example, if you're creating like weird stacks of stuff and you're not sure where you kind of, what your next move is, you can kind of, let's say, for example, just warp this a little bit. You can copy this, paste it onto this oscillator, mute this, play around with this one a little bit more, and now you've kind of got a point which you can kind of jump back to from the original. Does that make sense? So now you've got like 2 variations of that original kind of thing by just copy pasting. So that's pretty cool. One thing though that I wish we could do in Vital is copy and then paste oscillators to LFOs and LFOs to oscillators, but it's not quite there yet. I mean, that could be a cool future feature. Okay, so tip number 5 is quantizing of the pitch. So there's various ways you can do this. if you're using a lead that's kind of triggered with a MIDI, and we want to, for example, jump using randoms to kind of jump between octaves, the best way to do this would be to use a transpose snap and set just the C on. And what this is going to do is it's only going to allow octave variations of the root note to be modulated on the pitch. So if we set a random to modulate the pitch, it's always going to snap to an octave of the melody which we're sending in. Check this out. And the other way to use this would be in the context of something like a sequence. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a new instance of Vital here. And I'm just going to draw in one long MIDI note. And then here, for example, what we want to do is set a random to modulate the pitch. And let's set it to a sample and hold 1/16. And now we can draw in a custom scale that we want. Like let's say, for example, just C, a D sharp, and a G. So now it's going to randomly generate notes that are snapped to that chord within the randoms, and it's all going to be relevant to this root note. Okay, so tip number 6 is a simple one, but it could be very helpful for you guys. So this little zoom icon at the top here, you can use this to kind of zoom into, like view your envelopes a little bit better within Vital. So you may or may not know this, but if you double click it, it basically maximizes the view of your envelopes. So if we say, for example, put in a really snappy decay, double click, it's going to give us the exact, well, it gives us a little bit extra of viewing time, but it kind of snaps to exactly the view. Okay, well, it's got a minimum point here, but it just makes things a little bit easier, so instead of having to try and like scroll to find the best point, you just double click. Or if you like really zoomed in here to get your attack like curvy like this, then you can just double click to zoom out again. So this is particularly handy for quick workflow. So I just kind of had to throw it into this list. So another thing that's eluded quite a lot of people is the phase retrigger in Vital. So by default, phase retrigger is on. So what that means is every time the note is retriggered, it's going to generate a new phase start point. So what that means is in Vital, by default, the init saw waves phase retrigger is at the top of the ramp. It's over here. So in Serum, it's a little bit different. The phase retrigger is halfway through. So to get a snappier phase, people by default set the phase on Serum to default. But in Vital, phase at 180 is the same as Serum's init saw phase at 0, just so you guys know. But anyway, phase retrigger is over here. So by setting it to 0, you're going to maintain the exact same phase start point every time the note is retriggered. So for sidetrans bass lines or any kind of punchy repetitive sound, you're going to want to set your phase retrigger to 0. Okay, so tip number 8 is Vital's stereo modulation. So this is one of the massive, huge features that I think Vital has that kind of differs it from almost everything else on the market. It's the ability to modulate any parameter within the plugin in stereo. So what that means is, say for example, if we've got a lead here and we want different filter positions on the left and right, like say for example we want the left going up while the right goes down, and you want this kind of wavy filter movement. How we do this is on the LFO, let's just initialize this LFO real quick here, set it to sine. And let's apply I'm going to turn this filter off, and we're just going to apply a new filter over here, set the oscillator 1 so that it roots through it. I'm going to get to the routing a little bit later. And let's apply this to the filter, and let's listen to what's happening. it's a very monocentric sound. Obviously the delays and stuff are adding some of that kind of stereo movement that you're hearing. But now let's say, for example, we want to flip it so that the left and right have different movements happening. How it works with the LFO is it offsets the phase point of the left and the right. So by setting the stereo to 100%, your left will be at 50% when your right will be at 100% through the modulation. So knowing this, you can actually create some really tricky kind of like sample and hold type of shapes to get like exact panning movements and stuff. But it's also just a quick way to quickly create stereo filters or any type of stereo modulation in the patch. And then obviously the other way around would just flip which modulation is at 50% phase when the other one is at 100, if that makes sense. So this works with the randomization as well. With these randoms, say for example, if you've got like stuff happening here like LFO2 frequency, you can set this into stereo, and then this sets the modulation of the speeds of the LFO into stereo, which then further get modulated in stereo. So you're creating these incredibly wide sound design patches by just thinking about how to route the stereo modulation without having to get too technical about stacking oscillators and all sorts of things. So this is one of the huge things in Vital. You know, to do this type of thing in other synthesizers, you'd really have to have quite a big oscillator count. Okay, so this one might be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around if you don't understand, if you've never made risers and stuff in a plugin before. But one of the things about how the LFOs generally function is that if you're creating a riser effect and it reaches the end of the cycle, it snaps back down to the zero. Let me explain how this works. Let's just create a saw up. What I'm actually going to do is just initialize the sound, or we can jump over to this example sound that we created here. Let's just create like a white noise riser here. Set a shape like this and modulate the level. And let's modulate the pitch as well. And we can do various other things, like maybe put some effects on here. So now if we put this in our project and we just have like a single riser instance, what's going to happen is it's going to snap back down to zero at the end, and the delay tails and the reverb tails aren't going to kind of like fade out. However, if we set this into this LFO into envelope mode, the last node, it sticks on that node, and that's what the value that it kind of sticks at. So that's how we get the ability to kind of let those delays and reverb tails fade out. Okay, so tip number 10, I want to talk about some of the more obscure LFO modes. So most of the time we end up just using trigger and sync and maybe envelope mode with the LFOs, but Vital has 3 other modes which are pretty obscure. Loop point and loop hold, maybe not so obscure, but sustain envelope we're going to get to last. Okay, so loop point and loop hold allow you to create loop points in the envelope to do various things with. So for this example, I'm going to put a harmonic stretch. Let's just set this LFO to adjust the harmonic stretch, maybe the pitch and the level as well. And I'll show you how these loop points work. So I believe loop point works where it will play the LFO through the cycle and then loop indefinitely. As long as you hold the note, it will loop indefinitely from this phase position. Check this out. This is cool for creating weird bouncy ball effects by, let's say for example, modulating this phase parameter. And then loop hold is basically the other way. So it loops the beginning part. Okay, so then there's sustain envelope. This one is pretty weird. So what it does is when it reaches the sustain point of the envelope, it freezes the position that you select here on the LFO. Check this out. Okay, so the last thing I want to discuss about the LFOs for point number 10 is that you can punch in the exact values over here. So let's say, for example, we want to put this like 1/4 through the cycle. We would say 0.25 and it'll put it exactly 1/4 through the cycle, and then we can say enter point value and let's say 0.5 and it will put it at exactly the correct, like mathematically correct point. So this is a really nice way of putting in like really complex stuff and putting in the exact values that you want. So you could, for example, like snap things to much higher than what you actually allowed to snap to with these lines by putting in the exact values and getting extremely technical with it. So yeah, that's another cool thing about that. Okay, tip number 11 is the ability to freeze the LFOs. So you can do particularly interesting things with this. Let's say, for example, I'm just going to initialize this patch, and here you can just set this frequency all the way down till it says freeze. And what this allows you to do is, let's say, for example, draw in like a sample and hold type of pattern. And let's say, for example, send this to like a filter. By modulating this point over here, which I'm going to get to a little bit later, you can create these kind of like randomized things that aren't so random. You kind of like choose the shape and randomly kind of select at which point it's choosing that value. This is actually also a cool technique for being able to smooth a random parameter. Say, for example, you want to randomize something, but you want it a little bit smoother than the random is like snapping those values to. Then you can just draw in a kind of like sample and hold like shape on the LFO, and then just give it some smooth while you modulate this parameter. Okay, so tip number 12 is the Unison Modes in Vital. So most people know what Unison is. It's just being able to like stack up voices in a synth to create a wider sound. Most people don't realize that Vital actually has these advanced unison modes over here. And this allows you to do various, like pretty interesting things like create chords and all sorts of stuff like that. So here you can also change various parameters, how the voices are, either the tables are being, the wavetable is being, position is being modulated, the warp modes and that kind of thing, different for each voice in the unison, which is pretty interesting. But here is my favorite thing in the advanced unison modes is this stack setting over here. So you can create power chords. What you want to do is turn this detune range to 0 though. and Vital will generate you power chords. So this is a nice, interesting way of creating like guitar-like, old school, like video game-like theme tune type music. So you're obviously not just limited to power chords, there are various other things like major, minor chords. That's how you kind of like guitarize almost any type of sound. You just unison stack, put on one of those advanced unison modes, and it kind of makes anything sound like a digital kind of guitar. It just fattens up any sound. So for the theory behind it, obviously the octaves is just stacking up those octaves 4 times because there's 4 unison voices. Power chord is basically just adding a 5th. So for those who don't understand what the 5th is, it's just a +7 semitones. So because of perfect fifth theory and all sorts of things, that'll just always work with the power chord, which is pretty interesting. Major and minor generally only work on the root notes, and then the other stuff is kind of a little bit more experimental. Okay, tip number 13, I want to talk a little bit about the LFO delay and smooth and how that works. So the delay is essentially the amount of time it takes for the LFO to fully kick in, and then the smooth basically just smooths that parameter out, so it's not like exact values. What I'm going to do is apply an LFO shape like this to a filter. Another quick one I just want to throw in here. So legato, what that means is when you retrigger a note while you're holding another note, it doesn't reset the envelopes and LFOs. So notice as soon as I press that key, the movement of that LFO starts. Let's actually just turn this up in speed a little bit, so it's going to be a little bit more apparent. So if we turn the delay up, it's going to offset it by the amount of seconds that you see here, 2.6 seconds, until that LFO is in full swing. So by modulating the smooth and giving it some delay, you can create these really organic sounding LFOs, which I think is really, really cool. Okay, so tip number 14 is audio rate LFOs. So I think this is one of the most powerful things in Vital. I mean, Phase Plant has this as well, but the fact that you can key track your LFOs by clicking this button over here, key track, this turns the LFO into another oscillator. Granted, you can't hear the oscillator, but it saves you from using your audible oscillators as FM sources, because you can just use your LFOs as FM sources. For those who don't know what FM is, it's that kind of grindy tone that you get when you go like FM from B or FM Osc 2, whichever synth you're using. It's generally created by modulating the phase of a oscillator. That's how they create the FM sound. So if we just set this phase randomization to 0 and phase of the oscillator to 0 and get an LFO to modulate the phase and then key track it, we're getting FM. So what we want to do is just set the smooth down. That's so cool. So we're not limited to only using this for FM. We could use this to create audio rate modulation of the filters, which is how you create like really, really kind of croaky sounds, is by audio rate modulating a filter. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is mod remap. So this might be a little bit difficult to understand at first, but yeah, I've done another couple of episodes on mod remaps, so definitely check out my channel on those. They'll definitely help you understand it a little bit. So this is just going to be a quick run through of what the mod remap system is. So let's say, for example, initialize the preset. Let's set a LFO to the pitch. So this is just going to be a little bit noisy, but this is more to outline exactly what's going on with the sound. So if we just listen to what the sound is, as the LFO proceeds through the LFO shape, it modulates the pitch in a orderly fashion. So if we jump over to the matrix, every single slot in your mod matrix system has a mod remap. And what this allows you to do is change the logarithmic or exponential value, or whatever you change it to. Change the function value from input to output depending on the shape that you draw in. So if you give it a curve like this, it's going to be more exponential. And if you give it a curve like this, it's going to be more logarithmic. However, we're not just limited to curves. You can do anything here. You can create like square shapes so that it's a 50-50% offset. So when it's at the top, it sends out a pitch. When it's at the bottom, it sends out a pitch like this. And you can do various things in between, like create like semi-random type sounds from just a regular LFO shape. So this is a nice way of being able to create one LFO that does tons of different patterns within the patch. So say, for example, we've got like a filter and we want to modulate this filter as well with the same LFO, but a different shape. And then we can just jump in here and, for example, set a curve. And then we can, bear in mind, this is completely experimental, so this is probably going to sound horrible, but I'm just going to go a little bit wild here. Set this LFO to modulate a harmonic stretch. And then we can say, for example, like invert this like this way, do a curve, and then here, semi-randoms. You could go completely wild with it. Anyway, there are much more sensical musical ways of using this. Like I said, you can check out my channel. There's various ways of creating random gates. I'm going to get into that a little bit later on in this video, in fact. But various other ways of using this very creatively to create regimented types of random in your patch using the mod remaps. Okay, tip number 16 is key tracking of the oscillators, which you can turn on or off in the advanced panel over here. So here's the little option that allows you to turn note tracking on or off on the oscillators. So this is particularly handy for situations where you have a kick and you don't want to change the pitch of your transient, but you want to change the pitch of the fundamental of the kick. So what am I talking about here? I've got a basic kick patch that I'm creating. Let me just show you what happens when we change the key of the pitch. You'll hear the transient kind of gets a bit weird. I want to create a patch where the transient stays the same depending on no matter what we trigger, and the fundamental can be tuned. So this is really easy. I mean, here I've set up oscillator 1 as the transient. We can just jump in and turn note tracking off on oscillator 1 and leave note tracking on oscillator 2, which is what I've created as the kind of like fundamental layer. Now what we're going to have to do is actually go in here and tune this to the particular frequency that we think sounds the best. So now we can tune our kicks where the fundamental changes, but the transient of the kick stays the same. Okay, so tip number 17 is quite a simple one. It's the fact that you can shift drag these curves over here to drag them all at the same time. So this is particularly handy for creating like rhythms where you want to create like a couple of accented notes in the rhythm, like something like, let's say all of them go down like this, and then just a few of them will change the curves a little bit like this, and we can create these like almost organic moving patterns. Okay, so tip number 18 and 19 is kind of like a 2-in-1. It's the fact that you can access all of your modulations in the patch and be able to change the stereo-ness of the modulation. So you can turn stereo on and off from within the mod matrix by just using this LR like this. But you can also set any modulations within Vital to bipolar. So what that means is, as you can hear here, this LFO is adjusting this frequency of this filter, but only above the parameter that is on the filter. Bipolar means that it goes above and below, so through 0. And we can enable that over here. So now because we put stereo on, it kind of flip-flops where the center point is the parameter. But if we turn bipolar off, the center point will be between the parameter and the highest point of the modulation. Okay, so tip number 20 is less of a tip and more of a kind of little mini tutorial. I kind of just want to run through how the routing in Vital works. So generally speaking, the routing in Vital works on a top-down fashion for the audio components. So what that means is all of these oscillators feed downwards into the filters. You can choose the routing of these different components using these selector switches over here. And then in the effects, it runs downwards. So basically, you have the ability to run an oscillator either through the filter section, or you can bypass it and run it directly to the effects using this little drop down over here, or you can send it direct out. So this direct out is handy in situations where you want a sub oscillator that potentially doesn't have like stuff like reverbs and that kind of stuff on it. So let's say, for example, set this to a basic shapes and we've got a sub oscillator. And here, for example, let's set up a saw wave. And let's set this through the effects, and here we can put on stuff like chorus, delays, reverbs, the kind of things that we wouldn't potentially usually have on our sub oscillator. And this is a nice way of being able to like fatten up a sound, but then you still maintain a nice solid sub tone. Cool. So you can also choose which of the oscillators get sent through to which filters. So you can kind of get a stereo filter thing going on. Well, less stereo, but you can create like a parallel filter. Let's say, for example, run oscillator 2 through both of these filters, filter 1 and filter 2. The first one we can set to a low pass filter, and the second one we can set to a high pass filter. This way creating a sort of notch filter in the parallel movement of the sound. So you could just create a notch filter. I mean, you can do that. There are notch filter types in Vital, but it's cool to be able to, the versatility to create your own kind of custom filters and stuff is really cool. So let's say, for example, set all of these down to like, let's set the low pass down to minimum and the high pass something like this, and then let's macro control both of these. And now we've created a filter sweep that kind of sweeps both of those on a single oscillator source, while the sub oscillator gets fed directly to the outputs. So here's where the difference of parallel and serial filters come in handy to know about like what they are. As you can hear, because we're splitting the saw wave into two separate lanes, lane 1 is just allowing the low frequency through, and lane 2 is just allowing the high frequency through. But then they're kind of combining again at the output, so you kind of get this almost phasey like sound. If we take off the oscillator 2's input and set this to filter 1, what it does is it sends the output from this then into the second oscillator, or we can do it vice versa by doing it this way, sending the output out of filter 2 and then into filter 1. So these switches over here select what input is being sent to the filter. So here we're kind of creating a custom band pass filter. I'm actually going to turn off the sub. We can turn the volume up on this a little bit and we can distort it so we can really hear what's going on here. And you can get really experimental with this. You know, you could, for example, have like one oscillator that's sent to just this filter here. So it kind of bypasses the first filter in this chain of filters that you've created. And let's say, for example, set something experimental here, like something from side tables. Okay, so the next few tips we'll be diving into the Wavetable editor, and how you get there in Vital is using this little pencil icon on the oscillator. So the first thing I want to discuss is changing the phase from within the Wavetable. So actually what I want to do is let's just select something a little bit more complex over here, maybe something like a FM sweep from the Dadda side tables V3. And here what we can do is add a Wavetable modifier and click this phase shift. So what this allows us to do is actually shift the phase on a wavetable level. So per each frame in the wavetable, we can create different phasing. So this is particularly cool if, say, for example, we have certain frames where we want a different phase and we want to be able to like sweep it with like a modulation of the wavetable position. We can, you know, we've got free control over like sweeping the phase here, which is pretty insane. So now if we look at it like this, we've actually, you can see the wave moving backwards and forwards in the window over here, which is pretty crazy. Okay, so tip number 22 is creating custom filters within the Wavetable editor. So how we do this, let's just remove this one over here. And how we do this is we add what's called a frequency filter. And this allows us various different controls. We can create low pass, band pass, high pass, and comb filters from directly within the Wavetable editor. And the coolest thing about this technique is you can create sweeps. So we could sweep this shape up as the wavetable sweeps. And you're not limited to just one. You can stack these up. So we could say, for example, have like a band pass filter on top of this. And you can use this little viewfinder over here to actually see like what the band pass would actually look like. You know, you got resonance and cutoff like this. So let's say, for example, create a sweep where it sweeps the frequencies up like that, and maybe the resonance goes down a little bit. So you've noticed that I've added some distortion in this patch over here, and you don't necessarily need to add distortion in this. This is another really cool thing about the Wavetable editor, is you've got these kind of distortion modes as well. Here they call them wave warp. So what this allows you to do is, actually warp the wave. And as you see, the more you turn Y warp downwards, it distorts the signal, and it creates like a sine kind of, or more of a square, but it's a natural kind of distortion. It doesn't clip the sound. And then you've got Y warp, and then you've got X warp, which I guess is more of like a FM, like a shape that you can do. So you can kind of like FM the sound and distort it from within the Wavetable editor itself, which is particularly cool. Check this out. Oh yeah, you can actually sweep this as well. So we can, for example, turn the distortion down over time into more of a pure tone. And the coolest thing here is this is non-destructive, so you can move any of these points up or down to kind of like fine-tune the sound. Say, for example, you want the distortion before the filter, this comb filter that we created, or any of these filters, you can kind of swap them around, or you could like phase shift it afterwards to like really perfect the sound. So, I mean, you technically don't need any filters or distortions or anything in Vital. Just the Wavetable editor itself is enough of a synth voice. So the other two Wavetable modes that you get are Wave Folder and Slew Limiter. So Wave Folder is another kind of distortion type of sound. What it does is it basically folds the sound over on itself. As you can see, let me see if we can find like a less complex, yeah, something like this. It kind of distorts the sound to the point where it hits maximum, and then it folds over on itself. So this is a great way of kind of adding harmonics to the sound, and again, that's kind of what distortions are doing. So we can use this to kind of create a custom distortion sound where we can kind of sweep it in over time and get like real interesting with it. And then a slew limiter basically just like makes stuff less complex by slowing the rate of change at which these the kind of stuff can move. So in this sense, it's kind of like I guess when it's this complex, all it's doing is kind of just like digitizing the sound, like quantizing it to certain steps. But it's, yeah, not far from like a bit crush kind of distortion-y type of effect that you can get from the slew limiter. Okay, tip number 25 is phase of the LFO. And that is exactly what this parameter is over here. So I did say start point earlier, but it is actually the phase of the LFO. And this is particularly handy in various contexts. Let's say, for example, if we're doing that FM thing that we were doing earlier. So now we can actually sweep the kind of phase of the FM source, and that's creating like different tones. So you can get slight tones there by changing the phase of the LFO, by changing the phase of the FM source. But also, say for example, in a situation where we've got this doing a rhythm on like the level of the oscillator. We can use the phase to modulate, where this kind of like sequence is either starting or where it's playing from. So for more basic kind of like idea of how this works, let's say, for example, set a macro to control the phase. And for exact start points that are always lined up on the points of the sequence, we're going to want to jump into the mod remaps. This is what I discussed a little bit earlier, and set this up to an 8x8 grid, and then draw in steps like this. So what I've done is I've actually set up a preset. I think I've called it 8 step. I've set up a preset to do this because I use this so often to be able to like jump to different start points in a sequence. And you can see as I turn the macro on the LFO, it's only jumping to those nodes which are on the grid. Check this out. So this is really cool in a situation where we can, for example, randomize this macro, and let's say, for example, set this to sample and hold and 1/16. And then what happens is it's going to jump and choose random points in the sequence. So we're essentially getting a random gate sequence. So by using this theory, we can deduce that we can use an LFO as an extra macro. Say, for example, we run out of macros. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to jump over to my other example that I've prepared here for us. So say, for example, I haven't, but in this example, say, for example, we've used up all of these macros, and I want to create a macro another macro that can do various things within the patch. So if we just use an LFO that's like a ramp shape like this, and we set it to freeze, what we can do is we can assign this to various parameters in the patch. So let's say, for example, I'm going to put on a harmonic stretch over here as well, and let's assign this to, up the mix of the delay and the reverb as well. So we created a macro now, and if we sweep the LFO phase over here on the frozen LFO, this creates a macro. Check this out. Insane. I absolutely love that, because you can stack this as many times as you want. You can create a bunch of different LFOs, one macro that does like various different movements of those LFOs depending on your mod remaps and stuff. Wow, you can create some real amazing transition type of macros stacking these up like this. Okay, tip number 27, I basically just want to talk a little bit about the basic filter types. So if you're coming from Serum, the ladder style filters are going to be closest to Serum's MG style filters, except here you've got various other ones, notch blend, notch spread, and then the diode is going to be closest to 303 style filters. But you've also got various other ones which you can choose: analog, dirty, digital. Each one has various different things that come into play. They sound slightly different, they have different intricacies and stuff like that, and most importantly, the drive characteristic sounds different, which I'm going to get into. The formant filter, this is obviously closest to what you get from like the delay llama vocal type of sound. It's meant to emulate like a throat sound, so you can run sounds through it and it sounds like a voice. Comb filter, these are a little bit more experimental. I'm going to get to a little bit later on in the video, creating resonators and stuff using comb filters. And then the phaser filter. This is really, really cool. It's basically a frozen, it's basically a phaser effect that's in freeze mode, and it allows you to actually change the phaser live. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the phaser effect. Tip number 28, I want to talk a little bit about the drive characteristics and how this differs from most other VST plugins. Most VST plugins, when you turn up the drive, you expect it to be louder. In Vital, it's not like that. It's almost, in a sense, gain matching the sound, but it's not. All it's doing is it's imparting the characteristics of which the drive of that filter type would impart. It doesn't add any volume or anything like that, which I think is actually particularly cool, because a lot of people use the drive in Serum to turn up the volume of the oscillators before the filter, but in turn that changes the sound of the filter, because obviously it's now overdriving it, and there's various different characteristics of the overdriven filter, different types having different filter types, etc. You may like that sound, you may like it louder or not, it depends. In terms of gain staging, it's actually cool to be able to hear the difference of drive without any volume being imparted on it, because you can actually hear what the drive characteristics sound like without being biased to the fact that it's louder. Anyway, let me give you a couple of examples here. So let's go to the diode mode and let's create like a kind of resonant plucky filter sound. So knowing this, knowing the fact that the volume doesn't change the sound gives you freedom to just drive it up all the way and listen to the kind of like tone that it creates. You know, when generally sound designing, when you're going to drive something to the point where it's like at maximum distortion, you're going to have to then apply something afterwards to turn the volume down and all sorts of things that are going to change your gain staging. I think it's particularly interesting or particularly cool that they've set the drive as a kind of mix amount or whatever it is, that it's kind of gain matched on the output. So you can really hear the tonal difference of these different filter types and their drive characteristics, as opposed to just, oh, it's louder, it sounds better. Do you guys know what I mean? Okay, so tip number 29, arguably one of the coolest features in Vital is the resample preset to wavetable. So what this allows you to do is resample the exact preset you have to the wavetable. So what I like to do is create a bit of a sweep. So let's just say initialize this LFO and sweep the FM over here, just so that there's variation in the wavetable, so it'll like sweep over time. And then just click on one of the blank oscillators in the patch and say resynthesize preset to wavetable, and it records the audio output and it records it back in as a wavetable. So let's just disable all of the effects and everything. So we've recreated that sound as a single wavetable, and we can sweep through the different positions of that sound to get the tonal differences that we created with that sweep. So then if I like the wavetable that I've created, I'll generally right click and say save to wavetables, just call it whatever, and then I can use it in another patch. So we can say, for example, initialize patch, search for what we called it, demo lead 14, and now we've got this as a starting point for a new patch. What I really like to do is when I buy a new Vital preset pack or something like that, I just run through all the sounds, synthesize preset to wavetable, and just see what that wavetable sounds like, and just start saving them, and I've created a whole new bank of wavetables that I can create my own sounds with. That brings me to tip number 30 on the list, and that is how to manipulate the audio in the Vital wavetable editor. So how it works is you've got the start point and the end point, and you can adjust the window size. So let's say, for example, it's automatically detected the window size because of the pitch, which is pretty cool. But we can go in and enter like custom window sizes. So like allow less sample in the actual sound or whatever it is. So we can say 2056, and it'll be a more complex wavetable, a random number 5000, and it's allowed more cycles into the single wavetable. So in Serum, when you import the wavetable, you can choose the window size, and you've got a choice of 4 different sizes. So in Vital, you can import the sound and you can change that window size variably over time, which is pretty cool. And you're not just limited to those 4 choices. It does sound better, in my opinion, when it automatically generates the window size, but I mean, you're not limited to that, which is pretty cool. So how we change where we want the sweep, say for example, we just want to sweep this end part here and not like right at the end, like just this part here. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to click on this, which is the start point, and then move the window over here to like here, and then let's click on the end point and move this little purple window to here. And that's how we adjust what sweep we want to allow through from that audio file into the wavetable. So now we've got less audio file being swept here, so you can kind of get a little bit better resolution in the sweep. So you hear there's a bit of a wobbly thing happening in the middle. I want to avoid that. So let's move this a little bit backwards, and then let's move this a little bit this way beyond the wobbly thing. So this is another really, really cool thing about Vital, is that it's non-destructive. You can kind of fine tune it over time to get your best sounding wavetable that you can get. So tip number 31 is being able to stack stuff in Vital's wavetable editor. Check this out. So this is a pretty weird method that, I don't use too often, but, just like I said, knowing all the capabilities of Vital is going to make you a better sound designer in the plugin. What we can do is we can add another wave source here. And let's say, for example, draw in another saw wave. And let's add another one. And now we have 3 saw waves that are stacked on top of each other. If we jump in and add a phase shift onto each one and offset it ever so slightly, we're essentially creating something that's not too far off from the shape of a unison saw wave. So this is pretty interesting because you can create your kind of custom stacks this way, and you're not limited to just using a wave source. You can put filters on and all sorts of things. So you can get really, really interesting, kind of building these sounds up from the ground up. Like I said, we can jump in, and on each one, we could, for example, wave warp one of them to distort one of the waves. And let's maybe add a wave folder to another one. So you can create these like really complex, unique shapes, like really on a kind of molecular level using this technique. It's almost kind of, I don't want to say additive because it's not, but yeah, you get like a really kind of molecular approach to creating your wave shapes. So tip number 32 is something that not a lot of people talk about, including myself, because I don't know too much about music theory. And I'm not going to show you an example because I'll probably mess it up completely. But anyway, Vital allows for the import of microtonal files. So what those are basically files that allow you to tune notes different to what we know from the Western music scale. So this website here, sevish.com, has various, tuning files which you can download and load into Vital. There's also a scale workshop, which is like a tool that allows you to actually create your own microtonal files, which is pretty interesting. So like I said, that's a little bit too advanced for me, but in Vital, you click on your hamburger icon menu like this and click Load Tuning File. And it allows you to load up any tuning files of the format .scl, .kbn, and .tun tune. So any files in that format, you can load it up, and it basically detunes a C by a certain amount of hertz into different kind of like microtonal scales and things. A little bit too high. It's a little bit higher than my kind of pay grade in music theory, but I'm sure for those who know about it, it'll be interesting for them to know that Vital does allow that. So tip number 33 in Vital is key tracked EQ. So a few people like to use this on bass lines to remove specific harmonics and that kind of thing, although in a synthesizer which allows for additive control over your wavetables, it is a little bit pointless. That being said, is the ability to do it in Vital is pretty cool because, say for example, you've added a distortion and that kind of thing, and you kind of want to key track something. Anyway, I'm just going to show you guys how to do it, and you could use it if you want to. Okay, so we've got an initialized saw wave with the phase random set to 0, and let's add an EQ effect on here. So let's say, for example, we want to cut a specific node. What I want to do is I want to set this cutoff over here to a specific semitones that's correspondent to an octave. So that's 0, 12, 24, 36, 48, etc. And that would be dependent on which harmonic you're wanting to remove. We're going to play around with this a little bit, but let's say, for example, set it to 24. And then if we set the note to key track this, you want to set the modulation to all the way up to 128. And then what we can do is we want to set the semitones to values. We want to set this cutoff here to, let's say, for example, like 12. And notice how that notch jumps depending on where we punch the note. It's always equidistant from the fundamental, which means that we've created a key tracked EQ, and we can use resonance to kind of tune it down a bit. We don't have to do a full notch. We can gain it as much as we want, like this. So let's say, for example, we want to remove like the third harmonic, then we would punch in 36. You can actually do this with Vital's notch filters as well. So if we open up a filter and click notch spread, and we go like this, what we can do is we can actually tune the filter to key track and then punch in a specific semitone value over here, and it'll do a very similar thing. So I know for those Psytrance guys out there, a lot of you use key-tracked EQs on your basses. Just being able to do it within Vital is very cool. But again, like I said, being able to just remove the harmonics when you need them on a on the source, in my opinion, is a better idea. But being able to just knowing all these little tricks is going to make you better, like I said. Okay, so tip number 34 is being able to load a single cycle waveform in the noise oscillator, and this kind of turns the noise oscillator into an extra oscillator. So to get this functioning correctly, we're going to want to actually open up Vital's user directory and copy a single cycle waveform, something from one of your other wavetables or something, just cut out from the zero crossing to the next zero crossing in your DAW, and render that out into your samples folder in Vital. What I've done is I've actually taken, there's a pack of wavetables called the Dadda Side Tables V3. There's also a V2 and a V1. They're all amazing wavetables for Psytrance, or for a couple of different genres, of course. But there's a couple of single cycle waveforms in that pack which are really good, like FM sounds and stuff. So I just copied some of those into my samples folder so that I can load them up as a noise oscillator. So here what we can do is just click on, this is one of those FM things that I'm talking about, FM4SCW, that stands for single cycle waveform. And in Vital, if we click this little icon over here, it key tracks the noise oscillator. So now we've got the noise is basically creating an FM sound. Check this out. So that becomes particularly handy if you've got already like a full patch and you're using all 3 oscillators and you just want to add a little extra FM tone. Load it up as a single cycle waveform in your noise oscillator. So tip number 35 is similar to this, but it's with, instead of adding single cycle waveforms, we're adding audio loops so that we can either take advantage of the effects in Vital or we can manipulate the loops in various different ways. So I recently made a video on how to create psytrance, like uplifters and transitions using this technique, but you're not limited to just that. There's various things you can do for kind of more experimental stuff. So what I want to do quickly is I'm just going to find a loop in my samples drive and I'm going to load it up into Vital. We can get really experimental if we start modulating the pitch of the sample. So what that does is it changes the time. So this can get a little bit kind of like weird and glitchy, but yeah, I usually play around with like a sample and hold type of shape on an LFO to kind of like lock in a rhythm this way. Okay, so tip number 36 might seem simple for those who do understand it, but it's quite an advanced idea when in the greater scheme of things. So this idea is removing the fundamental. So what this allows us to do is stack oscillators and do various things like detuning a sub to fit detuning the sub to fit the kick drum, while the kind of like mids and harmonics are nice and present in the mix, or widening the mids and harmonics while your sub is dead center and that kind of thing. So first and foremost, an example where this might be handy is, say for example, we're creating like a drum and bass style Reese lead and we want a nice wide sound, but we want our subs to be mono and present. What we can do is, let's say for example, create a second oscillator, you set it to basic shapes. I'm just going to set the phase randomization of the sub oscillator to 0, so it retriggers the same every single time. And what I want to do is set the phase of this to 0 so that it starts on the up cycle and not the down cycle. Here with the saw waves, what we can do is we can just add some unison, which will traditionally detune it and make it sound wider, which should kind of add a kind of phasiness to the subs. I can actually show you guys what this looks like in a scope real quick. Do you see that fundamental dancing around the stereo spectrum left and right there? So here, what we can do is jump into the Wavetable editor and literally just turn down this first bar like this. And what that's done is it's removed the first fundamental of the tone. So for those who don't know, a saw wave is made up of a bunch of different sine waves stacked up in octaves and fifths on top of each other. And by removing the first one, we now have no movement happening on that first fundamental because it doesn't exist anymore. So you see that kind of like stereo movement only starts happening above the 100 Hertz range. So here, what we can do is add that sub in, and now we get the full sound again. The sub will be complete mono, while the top of the sound will have that stereo movement. This is also great in examples where, say, for example, you want to distort the mid-range and stuff, but you want a clean sine coming through again. What we can do here is, let's say, for example, set this sine to direct out, and then we can jump into the effects and add like distortion, compression, and all sorts of things to the top of the sound, like a reverb and that kind of thing. But that sine wave is still going to be clean. So tip number 37 is the fact that Vital banks are actually in WinZip format, just renamed. Let me show you quickly how to really easily create Vital banks. I feel like this is a little bit easier than the actual bank creator within Vital. I just prefer the kind of like workflow of folders and that kind of thing within Windows browser. Maybe it's just me. Anyway, I'm almost done with my Glitch Psytrance Essentials Volume 3 preset pack for Vital. Little plug. Shameless self-promotion over there. Anyway, once this pack is done, the easiest way to turn this into a Vital bank is to literally just right-click and add to archive, and make sure that, if you're using WinRAR, make sure that you choose zip format over here. And then what you can do is just change the file name so that the suffix of the file is Vital bank and not .zip. And you'll see here that we've created a Glitch Psytrance Essentials Volume 3 Vital bank. Now, if we jump into Vital, we can go import bank. So tip number 38 is creating switches using macros and mod remaps. So now we're getting into the territory of combining a bunch of the other stuff that I've talked about in the rest of this video, combining them in interesting ways to create like interesting macros and all sorts of things. So this one, we're using the mod remaps. So here what we want to do is, let's say for example, I want to create a macro that can switch between these 4 different oscillators. So it's going to switch. It's not going to kind of fade between them. It's going to be either or, one or the others. So how we set this up is we're going to want all the oscillators on to begin with, and we want to turn all the levels down. So here what we want to do is we want to go into, we want to set a macro to control the first oscillator's level. Then we jump into the mod remap, or into the mod matrix, and we check at the bottom here. We have a look at the mod remaps at the bottom here. So if you don't understand the mod remaps, reverse a little bit and check out the section where I spoke about those in a little bit more detail. But for this, what we want to do is, because we've got 4 different choices on the switch, we want to set this to 4 and draw a bar like this and 3 bars downwards. So it's important on the first one to set this first node up to the top. And now if we go back to the voice selection, we'll see that, while this macro is in the first 25% of its value, the first oscillator is on. And as we sweep upwards, as it goes above 25, that oscillator turns off. So we can use this technique to apply it to the second oscillator. And then here on this one's mod remap, we're setting it to something like this. So from 25% to 50%, the second oscillator is going to be on. And now we just expand this to the third and the fourth as well, or the noise oscillator. And let's just jump in, and on each one, draw in the corresponding shape for the mod remap. And on the sample, let's do the 4th bar. So now I'm just going to turn the volume down just in case it's a little bit loud. Now we've created a switch that can change these different oscillator types. So it's a little bit noisy and might not seem very musical at first, but if we set something like a note on random onto this macro, what's going to happen is every time we trigger a note, it's going to basically choose a different one of those oscillators. And we can then run all of those through to a filter and then apply a kind of global envelope to all of those to kind of create it into more of a synthy sound. So tip number 39 is being able to create random gate sequences using obviously the random generator and mod remaps. So how this works is, let's turn this level down to 0. And what I want to do is create, let's say for example, a 1/16 envelope on the level of this. Okay, so now every single 16th note it's going to retrigger. I'm just going to choose this long note and let this play. So I'm just going to quickly create like a FM tone by adding a second oscillator, detuning it, and saying FM from Osc 2 and turning the level down. So now, to make it a random, so that it only triggers every now and then at a random percentage that we set, what we can do is we can use this random modulator, and let's drag this onto the center point. You see that just before we let go, this green dot appears in the middle. So what that is the sidechain modulation of this macro, or of this modulation that's being sent. So this random parameter controls the amount of modulation that's now being sent here. So then on this random, let's set this to sample and hold, and let's set this to 1/16. So now if we play it, it's going to randomly adjust the velocity at which the sound plays. So we don't want that. We don't want a random velocity. We want it to be always at 100% velocity, but we want the probability to be randomized. And we can do that in the mod remaps. So over here, let's jump in and set this random to modulation 1 amount. And let's adjust this mod remap at the bottom here. And what we can do is we can choose a grid size of 10. And what this represents now is each of these bars represents a 10%. And then here, if we put these 2 bars at the top, this means that, or 3 bars or 4 bars, it means like 20, 30, or 40% probability that the random is going to trigger this gate. Check this out. Okay, we are on the home stretch now, guys. Tip number 40 is advanced chaining of sequences to create much longer melodic, like evolving sequences. So how we do this is we use several LFOs to kind of create a melodic pattern, and then we use a macro switch, like I showed you earlier, to switch between which of those LFO patterns is controlling the pitch at which time. And then you use a further LFO to control that macro switch. So this is a little bit tricky. Things are going to get a little bit complex here from this point onwards. So this is a little bit tricky, but follow along. This is such a cool technique, specifically for dance music, because once you have control of that macro, you could, instead of just using, for example, like a LFO to control that macro, you could modulate it over time to kind of jump between these sequences and move it at your own pace. So yeah, let's initialize this patch, and we're going to start diving into complex, advanced chaining of sequences. For those who don't know, you can punch in these grid sizes here in Vital, and what this allows you to do is, for example, we can say like 16/12, and then this gives us the ability to draw in arpeggiators that can kind of snap to a grid size of 16 beats or 16 steps in the bar and 12 semitones up or down. So what I want to do is I actually want to set this to 24 so that we can go up and down in the sequence, and then we're going to find the middle point. So actually what I'm going to do first is set this to 2 like this, and then we can go like this. Just initialize the thing to the middle point, and then let's mouse wheel up to 24. So now what we can do is we can go up in the sequence, but we can also go down in the sequence. So now what we want to do is we want to set this to control the pitch of the oscillator. If we hold control before we drag it, the modulation automatically gets applied in bipolar. Look here, right? However, we don't want it full 96 range. We want it of 24 so that it's 12 up and 12 down. So actually what I want to do, because there's going to be several sequences controlling the single pitch, it becomes a little bit easier to, instead of making this, each one individually control the pitch, we make one single kind of master pitch macro. So let's control drag this on there, set this to a range of 24, and then we get the LFOs to control this macro instead. And if we drag all of these 4 LFOs on here, and then we just jump into the matrix and we just make sure that these 3 are off for now. We'll get back to that just now. Then we can actually go in and edit each of them individually. For the 4th one, I actually want to create a bit of an envelope type of motion on a 1/16. So we can put a filter on here and let this apply to the filter. Okay, so now the trick is to go into each of these LFOs and to draw in a individual, like a different sequence, but using a similar kind of set of notes. So here we can jump into the second one and we can punch in 16/24 again. Okay, cool. We got 4 cool sequences here. So now the trick is to do the macro switch, like I explained to you guys a little bit earlier. So here we can do that with the second macro over here. So let's just disable all of these sequence macros, and then let's apply first one, and then set this to, there's 4 switches. So set this to 4, do this, set these bars downwards, set this to the second macro like this. Second one, these bars downwards, set this to the third macro like this, so on and so forth. And now we've created a switch that can switch between those different sequences. And now we can actually sequence that switch with a very long saw ramp. Check this out. Okay, so tip number 41 is less of a tip and more of kind of like a bug fix, I guess, because I see a lot of people criticizing Vital, saying that its envelopes are sloppy and that kind of thing, but I think they're just not understanding how things work within the fundamentals of the plugin. Or maybe what I've picked up is just on my system. Maybe I'm just one of the lucky ones that doesn't have this issue. But a lot of people say that when they're using the envelopes, they're specifically on something like a very fast envelope, on something like a filter on a saw wave, you can actually see it change over time. And in my tests, I could only really replicate this under one very specific condition, which can be replaced with other tools inside Vital. So let's talk about this real quick. Here is a very, very fast decay, very fast release on the cutoff of a filter, which is on a saw wave. You can see that that waveform is dead static. There's no editing happening here right now. That is a dead static waveform. However, when you add a little bit of hold, which some people like to do, it's a weird thing. I think with sound design, people have different ways of achieving different tasks. I think a lot of people like to use hold and then turn the curve down this way as opposed to that way. And the hold parameter in Vital seems to approximate a number of samples as opposed to sample accurate response. And this is where the problem comes into play. Check this out. So those who are criticizing Vital's envelopes, it's not sloppy. It's just the hold parameter which is sloppy in my opinion. But you don't even need the envelopes in Vital. You could just potentially use LFOs to do all of that stuff anyway. It's something that you may have picked up from my sound design techniques is I generally use LFOs for envelopes all the time because you've got more points. You've got way more control over creating your sound. So here, if we set this onto the cutoff over here, and we draw in an envelope shape, like a curve like this. Let's set this over to seconds, so we've got more of a kind of accurate response. And let's set this to envelope. So we can potentially just recreate that hold parameter by just drawing in the envelope how we want to, and punching in the exact amount of seconds that we want the cycle to take place in. I mean, if you want, I could let this loop for days, but I mean, that is sample accurate. It is as sample accurate as you can get. There's nothing wrong with Vital's envelopes. Number 42 is to quickly create another phaser filter by just freezing the speed of the phaser. So if we enable the phaser, you can turn this frequency all the way down to 0 to the point where it's frozen. So this automatically creates a kind of stereo phase filter. We can turn the stereo off by using this offset parameter like this, and then this parameter becomes the frequency of the phaser filter. So one of my favorite things to do is to use a random on the frequency of a phaser filter. And in fact, I'm going to use a note on random, and then we can just tweak these parameters a little bit. So you can actually freeze most of these effects in Vital that have a time basis. You can freeze like the chorus, the flanger, any of these you can freeze, and you can do some real interesting things with, which I'm going to get to shortly. Okay, tip number 43. Let's talk about MPE in Vital. So what is MPE? Polyphonic MIDI. What that means is you can trigger chords, and each note in the chord can hold individual MIDI data, whether that's pitch bend or a filter sweep. That's up to you. So in this example, I'm not going to do pitch bends because that gets a little bit weird and complex. I'm going to do filter sweeps, which is actually a really, really cool trick for creating chords that kind of like sweep and move and all sorts of things like that. So yeah, what I want to do is just create one long. So just a quick Cubase setup thing to get MPE working in Cubase. You got to set this MIDI channels here to any, and then you've got to give each of these notes in the sequence an individual MIDI channel. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. We can jump into Vital over here, and then in the Advanced tab, we want to select this MPE enabled. So what this does, this allows us to make use of this pressure parameter over here. And this is particularly interesting when you apply it to, for example, a filter. Let's just turn this filter all the way down and put the pressure parameter on this. So now if we jump back to our actual MIDI over here, we can jump over to the poly pressure, enable it, and then when we double click on a note, it opens up this menu over here. And now this allows us to draw in a filter sweep for each of those notes. You can also get it to control like the tremolo of that sound. So each of these notes has its own individual tremolo. You can get these really wide, expressive sounds using just very simple chords like the C and then the G. So we also have control over the actual pitch of the sound. So this might get a little bit experimental here, what we're doing. So let's just draw in one long note at the top here. Let's just set this to MIDI channel, like the last one, it doesn't matter. And here, instead of the poly pressure, well, we're going to have to give it some poly pressure just so it's audible. Then this one, we can click here, pitch bend, enable, and then double click on it again. And then we have the ability to actually draw in pitch of the note independently. So we can get like weird pitch sweepy things here. Okay, tip number 44. Have you ever thought, damn, I wish Vital had an extra note on a random? Well, you can actually create one using these randoms. So if you just set the random down to freeze, it actually creates a note on random in the particular style of that random. So Perlin, the note would like randomize each time, but like with a bit of a curve. Sample and hold will be like a traditional note on random. So check this out. Let me just load up a random wavetable over here and apply this random to this. So once it's frozen, check. I'm just going to hit notes randomly. Okay, tip number 45 is creating custom reverb-like tones using the chorus and modulating these time parameters ever so slightly with randoms. So by default, these parameters are, when this is not frozen, these parameters are modulated by like a sine LFO type of movement. But that's not very kind of natural in terms of like the acoustic response of an actual space. We want to go for something a little bit more randomized. So if we apply just a tiny bit of random, like I'm talking like 0.5%, I mean 0.0, like between 0 and 0.05, like somewhere around there, different type of random on each one of these parameters, very, very tiny increments. You can create these like custom reverb-like tones. Check this out. tip number 46 is creating glitchy sounds by modulating the delay times within Vital. So what I want to do is I want to pop open that loop that we had earlier. So the trick here is to turn this to seconds, and then here to turn this down really low, and listen to what happens when we like modulate this delay time at very low increments here. So the trick is to find like the lower extent of the time that you want to use and then add a LFO shape to modulate upwards from there. And now here what we want to do is we want to set in some steps to modulate these delay times. Okay, tip number 47 is being able to extend the range of parameters outside of the bounds of what they visually show on the screen using stuff like macros or frozen LFO and that kind of thing. So how does this work? Let's say, for example, we've got a formant filter over here. And you'll notice that when you get to the bottom here, you can't sweep any further than this kind of peak frequency. However, if you set a macro onto this and let it modulate backwards, the more you turn up the macro, the more that filter goes down. And you can kind of stack this up almost indefinitely to go like further and further and further down. And this is particularly interesting in situations like with flanges and that kind of thing, where the more you go down, the more it turns into a delay effect. And you can do all sorts of weird resonator type things, which are my next few tips. But for this is just particularly interesting for being able to like extend the range of stuff within the plugin. So like I said, this works with phases, flanges, like any of the actual effects as well. But particularly interesting is the comb filters. So here, if we set this up and this up like this, and we can then get this kind of cutoff range to go further outside of the bounds of what it's kind of allowed to go within the interface. And this kind of creates an echo or delay effect. Check this out. So tip number 48 is being able to create resonators with the flanger effect in Vital. So what I'm going to do is just turn off this filter, and I'm going to leave this like percussive thing that I've got here on this envelope. That just kind of like lets that first little bit of the sound through. Here, let's jump into the effects and let's enable a flanger. Here what we're going to want to do is turn the frequency to freeze and then turn the offset down so that the left and the right are playing the same thing. Here, the center parameter, what we want to do is we want to set this to a semitone that's according to like the root note, for example, like 0, 12, 24, etc. Let's go with 12. Then what we can do is we can set this note parameter to modulate the center. And let's just make sure it's going all the way to 128. So that sound you're hearing is being generated by the flanger. The pluck is just triggering the flanger to begin, and it's this kind of like self-resonating feedback effect that happens when you tune a flanger to specific note frequencies. And that's pretty interesting. It's the same thing as like a delay and all sorts of things when you're creating a resonator effect or car plus strong type of synthesis. I'm going to be doing a video on like a kind of deep dive onto why everything is actually a delay. But in the meantime, everything is actually a delay. So we could use this theory to our advantage to create like a resonator effect from almost any type of effect by just tuning that kind of frequency of that feedback. Okay, to prove my theory to you that the sound is being generated by the flanger here, I'm going to change this oscillator here to a noise source and then set this to pluck this level here of the noise. It only changes the kind of tone of that transient ever so slightly. So tip number 49 is doing the same thing, but with comb filters. So like I said, everything is delays. Comb filters are basically delays. So if we turn on this filter over here, we turn on comb, and we resonate it a little bit with this resonance, shift this up to give it some high frequencies, and we key track it. This key track automatically does all of that kind of like key tracking stuff for us. And then here, we've got various different kind of like comb filter modes that we can choose from that have different resonator styles. But the trick here is to set it to something like that's relevant to, like, again, the root note, like 0, 12, 24, or minus 12. Remember, the sound is being created solely by the filter itself. Let's turn off the filter and listen to what we're hearing. Just the transient. Very, very interesting, hey? So, tip number 50, we are going to use a bunch of the tips that we've spoken about in previous episodes to make a massive multi-layered patch, which we can trigger with just a single MIDI file that can create a kind of layered, like almost a full track that we can kind of just add kick, bass, percussion to and call it a day. That's the goal here. So, first and foremost, what I want to do is do a single cycle FM waveform in the noise, and then we can create like a random gate to trigger that. So here, let's turn this level down. Let's create an LFO to modulate the level. Let's set it to 1/16. Let's do a shape something like this. Then let's set a random to modulate the sidechain of that parameter that's going through to the level. And then let's set this to a sample and hold at 1/16. And then we can jump into the mod remaps and just set this to a 50/50 square like this. So now what I want to do is I want to set a filter to just the sample oscillator, and we can set this to a band pass and set it to a 24 dB. And then let's set a the same random to modulate the cutoff value. So I want to edit this mod remap just so that it's not linear to what the input is, so that we're getting a bit more of a random on this cutoff. So now what we can do is we can use the inverse of this random to trigger another oscillator so that it kind of flip-flops between the two. So what I want to do is let's just enable oscillator 3. I'm going to save oscillator 1 and 2 for more of a main leady type thing. And what I want to do is I want to use a key tracked oscillator here to create like a fake FM. Let's set this to modulate the phase, set this down, modulation all the way up, phase retrigger to random to 0. Okay, so here we want to set the LFO 1, which is our kind of like envelope thing, to modulate the level of the oscillator 3. And then let's set the random to modulate that side chain of that modulation. Then let's jump in here, and here we want to set it so that the bottom half triggers and not the top. And then this first node needs to be up. So this modulation is like this. So every time the random is above 50%, it triggers the sample. And every time the random is below 50%, it triggers the oscillator. And what we can do is, just to give it some gap in between, we can say anything below 30% triggers and anything above 70% triggers. So we've got this kind of dead space in the middle for a bit of extra groove. So what I want to do is, I want this sound to be able to, I want to process the sound as like a wavetable. So I'm going to turn the level up all the way. I'm going to turn the delay off. I'm going to resample this preset to wavetable. So here we've created the filter inside the wavetable editor for the oscillator 3. And then we have this filter created, this filter is changing the sound of this sample. So this leaves a filter over here open for oscillator 2, for example. And then with like oscillator 1, we can send this one like directly through to the output, or however we want to do it. Yeah, we can keep stacking and keep stacking with this idea. You know, in oscillator 2, we could even create the filter in the oscillator itself, or we could use the filter that's in one of these modes, like low pass, this distortion mode over here, as one of the filters. Check this out. So here let's draw in a sequence. Let's say sync. Let's say 2/1, 16. Let's go 32, 24. Actually put it in the middle first. This. Up to 24 here. Then let's set this to modulate this. Hold control so it's bipolar. Right click and enter the value. See, what is it? 48, enter value to 24. Oh, that sounds great. So now on this one, let's maybe create like a power chord, and we can create maybe like a pad type of sound on this layer. Let's send this one through to filter number 2. Let's enable this. Let's maybe give this a high pass filter. Let's turn the Unison modes up. Let's jump into the advanced, and let's set this unison to power chords, and let's turn the detune range down. So I really like creating patches like this because it's almost like an instant inspiration to start a track. You know, when you've got something like this, you can kind of jump in, you know, create, set it to kind of any pitch that you want, change it to kind of like any tempo that you want, and it's already like a basis to start working from. You could always, you know, remove some of the layers and adjust it to suit your specific needs. But I think having these kind of instant inspiration, multi-layer patches is particularly powerful, so learning to create them is definitely a good idea. Awesome, that is about it. Yes, oh my gosh, I actually got through that list, can you believe it? All 50 tips for Vital. And if you skipped through the beginning of the video and you didn't catch the first little bit, it is Vital's birthday, hopefully today, if I get this video done in time, which has been quite a mammoth task so far. But anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you like this kind of more crazy, in-depth, long 50 kind of tips videos, then let me know. Or if you like the shorter things, also let me know. I always like to hear your guys' feedback. Anyway, if you haven't yet, consider hitting that subscribe button, hitting that like button, all the little things. I'm going to be posting links to a bunch of other YouTube creators in the description below. I'm sure a bunch of these tips and ideas came from them. One in particular is Broth. I'm pretty sure that a lot of these ideas were inspired by stuff that he does. He's really good at thinking about plugins out of the box. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. As always, see you guys next time. Cheers.